Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Gabby Duan. Gabby Duan was born on December 26, 2007 in the small town of Scottsville, Kentucky, with a population of just over 4,000 people. Scottsville was mostly a farming community where many folks knew each other well, or at least knew someone from each local family. Like in many similar small towns, there weren't a lot of entertainment options in Scottsville. The only major thing for locals was school sports, particularly football. The local school had pretty decent fields for football, baseball, and tennis, where they regularly hosted games and competitions. It became a sort of tradition for locals to attend these activities, especially if their children were involved. Gabby's family was no different. Her parents had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. The oldest boy was on the school's football team, while Gabby herself got into cheerleading in November 2015 when she was 7. Their town was gearing up for the biggest football game of the year, and Gabby's older brother was on the team. However, Gabby was more interested in just hanging out and having fun with other kids than in the game itself. Her parents initially planned to leave Gabby at home with their youngest son under the care of a relative, but Gabby managed to convince them to take her with them. On the evening of November 14th, they headed to the school field. Besides the local crowd, there were also many folks from the other county who came to watch the game and support their team. As soon as their family arrived at the stadium, Gabby spotted her friends and asked her mom if she could go play with them. Her mom agreed, but warned her to stay within the school grounds and stick with the other kids. After that, her mom went to the bleachers and Gabby ran off to her friends. From then on, Gabby dashed back and forth to her mom a few times before going off to play again. At some point, she also came to her dad, who was in an announcement room, and Gabby asked him for some money to buy some snacks at the concession stand before darting away. Sometime later, Gabby's friends ran up to her mom in the bleachers. She glanced at the group and immediately noticed her daughter wasn't among them. The girls asked if she had seen Gabby, and they seemed visibly worried. The woman replied that she hadn't seen her for quite a while. She then asked what was going on, and the girls explained they had decided to play hide and seek. Gabby was supposed to find them, and they hid in the restroom, but time passed, and Gabby never found them. Thinking they had won, the girls left their hiding spot and went to look for her, but Gabby was nowhere to be found. They called her name, checked all the places they had been playing before, but their friend seemed to have vanished into thin air. That's when they thought Gabby might have gone to the bleachers to her mom and ran there. Her mother immediately started to panic and went to her husband, but Gabby wasn't there either. She told him that Gabby was missing, and he rushed to search the area around the stadium. Meanwhile, the mother went to the concession stand where her daughter had wanted to buy some snacks and began searching for her there. On the way, the parents met their friends and informed them about their daughter's disappearance. Hearing that, they joined the worried parents, helping with the search. After scouring the entire area around the stadium and finding no sign of Gabby, the parents went back and made an announcement over the loudspeakers, hoping Gabby would hear it, but that yielded no results either. By that time, there was a break in the game and people were returning to the bleachers. The parents continued asking everyone if they had seen Gabby, and some of them joined in the search as well. They went out again to search the area around the stadium and asked the staff to turn on flashlights around the baseball field, which led to a small forest. The adults walked through it, but still couldn't find her. By this time, about 20 minutes had passed since her disappearance, and the parents decided to call the police. Officers immediately arrived at the school, listened to the parents' and Gabby's friends' accounts, and began searching. The local police department had little experience with such serious cases, as child disappearances rarely occurred in their small town. The officers immediately considered the worst-case scenario that someone had abducted or attacked her. In that case, they faced one problem. The likely perpetrator was probably at the stadium watching the game which was about to end any minute. So the officers realized they had very little time, and soon people would start going home, including the alleged perpetrator. Eventually, they decided to halt the game and lock down the stadium, keeping everyone inside the building. Officers watched every exit to prevent anyone from slipping away. The police didn't inform people about what was happening to avoid disrupting the search efforts. If everyone knew that the police were considering the possibility that a kidnapper of a 7-year-old girl was in the same vicinity as them, the situation could quickly escalate. Meanwhile, state police arrived at the school and began searching the area. They reached the baseball field and headed into the woods. After some distance into the trees, they stumbled upon a small creek and saw her body in it. They identified her as Gabby and called for an ambulance to take the body to the medical examiner. However, even a visual inspection was enough to suggest that the cause of death was asphyxiation, as there were distinct marks on her neck. Part of her clothing was also missing, leading the police to suspect that the victim had been sexually assaulted. Gabby's mother saw the ambulance near the woods and thought the police had found her daughter who needed medical attention. She rushed there, but the police stopped her as they didn't want the woman to see this horrifying scene. Now that the police were dealing with a murder, they decided to move everyone from the stadium to the school gym. Investigators believed that the killer was likely among them, so they needed to quickly figure out how to identify them. They spoke to Gabby's parents and told them about what likely happened to their daughter. Investigators also asked if they had any suspicions about who could have committed such a heinous act. Perhaps they had noticed someone suspicious, or someone had threatened their family. But Gabby's parents insisted they had no idea who could have done this. Detectives then talked to Gabby's friends and asked if they had seen anything strange that evening. Maybe someone had been watching or following them. But the girls said they couldn't recall anything like that. The police also brought them to the gym and asked them to look carefully at the people present, hoping they might remember something, but it didn't lead to anything. The lead detective continued to believe that the victim's friends might have seen the kidnapper, but either they were afraid to point him out or simply didn't understand the significance of their observations due to their age. He kept asking them to remember every moment of that evening, and finally, one of them mentioned that when they hid from Gabby in the restroom, she saw a man near the door. She remembered almost no details about his appearance except that he was wearing a denim jacket. The police spoke to the cashier who sold tickets to the game, and he also recalled the man with the denim jacket hanging on his arm. He added that this person seemed strange and intoxicated to him. However, they still couldn't identify this man. At that moment, the police gradually interviewed the attendees of the game, and pretty soon, everyone learned why they were being held there. Realizing that they might be in the same room with the killer, people were frightened, especially for their kids, but still cooperated with the police and answered their questions. Investigators cross-referenced the list of names of all the men in the gym with a sex offenders registry, but there were no matches. The police also sent officers to the homes of several such offenders living within close proximity, but they all had solid alibis, and none of them were near the school. Meanwhile, officers continued to interview people at the school, and they soon came across some interesting leads. Several individuals told them that during the game they saw a man named Timothy Madden near the women's restroom behaving strangely. He was a local resident, so many people knew him, but according to witnesses, that evening he was acting suspiciously. They also mentioned that he was wearing a denim jacket, the same description provided by one of Gabby's friends who had also seen a man near the restroom. Another witness was a distant relative of Timothy. He mentioned that during the game, Timothy seemed kind of off, and his younger son was playing on the field. But according to the witness, Timothy, who usually was very involved in his son's sports achievements, wasn't even paying attention to the field and seemed lost. Several more witnesses told the police that Timothy's behavior seemed strange to them, prompting investigators to talk to him. It was already nighttime, and they had to release almost everyone from the school. They decided to visit him, but first asked the local sheriff what he thought about Timothy. The sheriff said that he had known him practically all his life and highly doubted that he was capable of such a crime. Timothy had almost no criminal record except for some traffic fines, and he had never been involved in any suspicious situations before. Timothy lived with his wife and 5 children, and the police decided to go talk to him immediately. When they knocked on his door, Timothy opened it, and the officers asked if he knew why they were there. He replied that he had heard about her murder, but had nothing to do with it. Detectives then decided to try one trick and asked him a loaded question. They asked whether he had any explanation for several videos provided by eyewitnesses, showing him talking to Gabby shortly before her murder. There were no videos or witnesses, and the question was designed to prompt the man to reveal some new information if he indeed had something to do with the crime. At first, Timothy said he didn't know, but then he quickly corrected himself. He admitted that he did talk to Gabby that evening near the stadium. According to him, he stepped out to smoke, and at that moment, several girls ran past him. Shortly after, Gabby passed by and asked if he had seen her friends because they were playing hide and seek, and she needed to find them. Timothy pointed her in the right direction, and she ran off. The detectives found it suspicious how quickly Timothy changed his story. Moreover, his account indicated that he spoke to the victim just minutes before her disappearance, and at that time, there were no witnesses outside the stadium, so it gave him the opportunity to commit the crime. The detectives also asked if he would have any explanation if they found his DNA on the victim's body, and Timothy calmly replied no. Finally, they asked him to provide them with a DNA sample and the clothing he wore at the stadium. He agreed to both requests, but as soon as Timothy handed over the clothing to the police, they discovered some stains on it. There was something resembling blood stains on the pants, denim jacket, and even underwear. Detectives asked if he could explain it, and Timothy claimed that they were insane and that it wasn't blood, but some dirt. However, the police thought otherwise, although they needed to wait for the DNA analysis results before they could arrest him. Even though this case was a priority for the lab, it still took several days for the experts to examine all the samples and conduct the analysis. The forensic pathologist soon finished examining the body and confirmed that Gabby's cause of death was manual strangulation. He also confirmed that the victim had been brutally assaulted and extracted a biological sample of the perpetrator, which was sent to the laboratory the day after the murder. Something unexpected happened. The police received an anonymous letter from someone who reported a suspicious individual present at the game. The author wrote down the model of his car and even the license plate, which allowed the investigators to quickly identify the owner of the vehicle. It turned out to be a student living half an hour's drive from Scottsville. The police went there and began questioning him, but the guy claimed he hadn't been to any game and hadn't even heard of the murder. He added that he was at work that evening, and the police found undoubtful confirmation of his alibi. He was crossed off the list of suspects, but the author of the letter was never found. Perhaps someone decided to frame him or play a cruel prank, but the guy was truly innocent. The police soon received another lead. Several people reported strange behavior by a local 16-year-old boy. He told different people that he had been at the game, but then claimed he hadn't attended it. The young man also mentioned seeing girls playing hide and seek. Detectives found out that this boy was Timothy Madden's son, but that wasn't the most surprising revelation. They learned that just 2 weeks before the murder, the boy had become angry with his father and held a knife to his throat, threatening to kill him. Knowing this information, the police headed to speak with him. But there was a problem. They needed the presence of the minor's parents, and his mother refused to provide a DNA sample, leaving the police empty-handed. In Scottsville, a small town where everyone knew each other, rumors spread like wildfire. People heard that the police were looking into the Madden family regarding Gabby's murder, sparking various theories. Some thought one of Madden's troubled older sons could be responsible, while others suspected Madden himself or thought he might be covering for his sons. Gabby's parents also became aware of these rumors, which came as a big shock to them. Gabby's father had known Timothy since 3rd grade and also knew his whole family. Their sons played on the same football team, and their daughters were cheerleading together. Both families were close, even sitting near each other at the game. With all this in mind, Gabby's parents found it hard to believe that anyone from their circle could have been involved in the murder. After the rumors spread around town, something else happened. The eldest son of the Madden family, who was 20 years old, began contacting local officers on social media. He used foul language and threatened them, demanding they leave his family alone. He was immediately arrested for the threats, and the police quickly discovered that there was an active warrant for his arrest in another town. It turned out he was suspected of assaulting a minor girl. They brought him in for questioning, and the young man claimed he was simply frustrated by the accusations against his family. He also said he had nothing to do with the murder and that he was at his cousin's house in the neighboring town that evening. He agreed to provide his DNA sample, which was also sent to the laboratory on November 20th. 6 days after the murder, Gabby's funeral took place. Hundreds of people came to say goodbye, not only from Scottsville, but also from other towns. People donated a significant amount of money to Gabby's parents to help cover the funeral and farewell ceremony expenses. Meanwhile, the lab completed the DNA analysis and compared the blood and semen samples with Timothy and his son's DNA. The results showed a complete match. The semen found on the victim's body belonged to Timothy Madden, and the blood on his clothes belonged to Gabby. Upon receiving this news, detectives went to the funeral when Gabby's parents were alone and informed them of the discovery of the killer. At the same time, the police officers went to Timothy's house and he was arrested. As he was being transported from the police station, he shouted to the gathered reporters that he was innocent. Later, he claimed that the blood on his clothes was his own, as he had scratched himself passing by a fence, even though initially he had told the police that it wasn't blood at all but mud. With the DNA match in hand, the investigators took the case to court and the prosecution stated they would seek the death penalty. During the trial preparation, Timothy's lawyer insisted his client was innocent and that the origin of the evidence raised serious questions. He argued that during the supposed murder, Timothy was at the stadium filming the game, even though Timothy himself had told the police he saw Gabby around the same time. The lawyer also tried to point out the fact that Gabby's body was found in a creek, but his client's clothes were dry when he returned to the stadium. Timothy's mother, who lived with him, stated that Timothy returned home in clean clothes, didn't look troubled, and behaved as usual. However, the prosecution pointed out that all these arguments crumbled in the face of the fact that the suspect's semen was found on the victim's body. There could be no other explanation for this, and therefore, there was no doubt about Timothy's involvement. According to the police, his account of that evening contains some portion of the truth. He could have indeed stepped out of the stadium during the game and encountered Gabby, who was looking for her friends. She knew Timothy well because he was the father of one of her friends. She might have approached him and asked where the other girls had gone, and that's when he devised a plan. He could have said they ran into the woods behind the baseball field and offered to escort Gabby there. Once they were a few hundred yards away from the school, he could have assaulted and killed her, then returned to the game. The wait for the trial dragged on for years, much to Gabby's family's dismay. They wanted the murderer to be punished, but due to bureaucracy, the case progressed slowly. In 2019, 4 years after the murder, the parties began discussing a possible plea deal. The prosecution offered to drop the death penalty in exchange for a life sentence, with Timothy having to admit his guilt. Gabby's parents agreed to this option because the endless wait for the trial was a heavy burden for them. Moreover, if the trial finally began, they would have to attend hearings for months, essentially reliving their daughter's death all over again. Timothy, who kept insisting on his innocence, eventually agreed and confessed. However, the terms of the deal didn't require him to reveal the details of what he did. He just had to admit his guilt. These terms didn't satisfy Gabby's family because they wanted the perpetrator to fully confess to what he had done to their daughter. During the court hearing, Gabby's father started yelling at Timothy, while the defendant's relatives began shouting at Gabby's family. Eventually, the judge had to take a break and separate them. In the end, Timothy received a life sentence and went to serve it in a maximum security prison. But that's not all. In 2016, a year after Gabby's murder, something else happened involving Timothy Madden. A boy from a neighboring state saw a news report about the crime and recognized Timothy. Several years ago, he and his friend were walking near a mall parking lot when an adult man approached them. He tried to convince the boys to get into his car for a ride, but they found the offer extremely strange and ran away from him. The friend's relative contacted the police, and according to the boy who saw the news report, he was no other than Timothy Madden. However, there was no substantial evidence for this case, so it didn't progress any further. Nevertheless, if Timothy had indeed attempted to abduct two boys in another state, it could tell us about his true nature more clearly. Perhaps before Gabby's murder, he had been trying to find other victims but had no success. And on that evening when she approached him near the stadium, he decided to seize the opportunity to satisfy his horrific fantasies. The case of Sheila Labar, a monster with an angelic appearance. Psychological and physical traumas received at an early age can have a very unpredictable effect on adult life. Of course, far from always, they lead to the fact that a person becomes cruel and seeks to hurt others. But sometimes it is the trauma can give rise to a real monster. Criminal psychologist Adrian Rain believes that there are genetic and psychophysical mechanisms that can turn a person into a cold-blooded killer, about which he wrote in detail in his book, Anatomy of Violence. History knows a lot of serial criminals who had a truly hellish childhood, and perhaps to them can be attributed our heroine today, Sheila Labar. This woman had an angelic appearance which she skillfully used, seducing her victims and then brutally murdered them. Despite the fact that the court was able to prove only 2 of her crimes, criminologists are sure that there were many more. And now let's look at this difficult story from the beginning and try to understand whether Sheila Labar was a born monster or became him as a result of the cruelty that she faced in childhood. Who is Sheila Labar? Sheila Labar was born in 1958, the 4th of July, in the small country town of Fort Payne, Alabama. She was the youngest of 3 children of her parents and was raised with her brother and sister Lynn. Her childhood was spent in a picturesque but rather secluded place, on a farm nestled among cornfields. According to the memories of Lynn's older sibling, Sheila was an active, inquisitive, and open-minded girl with a creative streak. She liked to be in the center of attention, had a good voice and cute appearance, so perhaps, if her life had turned out differently, she would have become a famous actress or singer. But instead of bright posters, her name decorated the pages of criminal chronicles. The unimaginable cruelty of her father, the head of the family, Manuel Bailey, for many years suffered from alcohol addiction, although it would be more accurate to say that his addiction suffered from his entire family. He often went on binges, turning into a real beast who enjoyed abusing his wife and children. He insulted and humiliated them, beat them with anything that came to hand, could throw everyone out in the middle of the night in a downpour or frost, and locked himself in the house, not letting anyone inside. Mothers, daughters, and sons often had to spend the night in a barn or in the open air in the field. One day, when Manuel was once again in a drunken rage, he began throwing dishes and other objects at his family members. The mother tried to cover the children as best she could, but one of the flower pots thrown by her husband hit her youngest daughter Sheila in the head. Sheila suffered a serious concussion and a lifelong scar on her temple, which she painstakingly covered with her hair. But not even the insults and beatings were the worst thing that the sisters had to endure in their parents' home. According to the memories of Sheila and Lynn, Manuel from an early age forcibly inclined them to intimacy. The mother may have been aware of what was going on, but the subject was never broached. However, despite the nightmare at home, Sheila did well enough in school. She dreamed of leaving the farm as soon as possible and go to conquer the big city. The girl was quite ambitious and determined. She passionately wanted to realize her childhood dream in life and become an actress or pop singer. And she had everything for this: charisma, bright appearance, and a beautiful voice. Adulthood, first marriage. Barely Sheila was 18 years old. She left her parents' home, but adult life was not so joyful. To enter the university, she was not allowed to average score, and to move to the big city, she simply did not have the money. Then Sheila got a job as a maid in one of the hotels, where by that time her older sister was already working. It should be noted that Sheila had a slender figure and a very attractive appearance. She had big blue eyes, a charming smile, and a mop of thick long hair. She was surrounded by attention from men, and over time, she learned to use it and manipulate her suitors. In the late 70s, LaBar, then Bailey, met a guy named Jonathan Baxter, and a romantic relationship began between them. Jonathan was not yet 20 years old at the time, but he already had a young daughter from a previous relationship. However, the child did not become a hindrance, and soon the couple got married. However, this marriage lasted only a few months and collapsed after Jonathan learned that the young wife abused his daughter while he disappeared at work. Sheila was frankly annoyed with the child, and she would raise her hand or lock her in a closet if she started crying or acting up. Jonathan did not organize scandals and listen to explanations. He just Strasut filed for divorce and put his wife with his belongings outside his house. He never wanted to see or hear from her again. After the divorce, Sheila dated various men and mostly lived off them. But all these relationships were fleeting and lasted from a few weeks to a couple of months, until in the early 80s she met her future second husband, Ronnie Jennings. The tumultuous romance soon led to marriage, and Sheila took on a double last name, Bailey Jennings. It was an unhealthy relationship between two irascible and unstable people who regularly cheated on each other, scandalized, and even fought. Still, their marriage lasted more than 3 years. In 1984, after another family quarrel, Sheila demanded a divorce from her husband, but he refused her. In fact, Ronnie did not hold on to the relationship at all. He just wanted to piss off his wife and make her mad, and he succeeded. Sheila became hysterical, took a large number of drugs in front of her husband, drinking strong alcohol, and after this infernal cocktail, sat behind the wheel of the car and rushed down the road. Naturally, soon Sheila, under the influence of pills and alcohol, lost consciousness, flew off the road, and at high speed crashed into a tree. She miraculously survived, but suffered a massive head injury. She spent more than a week in a deep coma, and doctors made no prognosis. When Sheila finally regained consciousness and gradually recovered, she was transferred to a psychiatric hospital where she spent several months. She later complained to her sister that one of the orderlies was constantly harassing her and possibly taking advantage of her helpless state when she was heavily sedated. After all this, Sheila returned to her second husband's home, but began to behave not just aggressively, but threateningly toward him. When during another scandal she attacked Ronnie and poked him in the chest with nail scissors, Ronnie, fearing for his own life and health, filed for divorce and hurriedly moved out of the mad woman. Rich lover. When the second marriage was dissolved, the young woman began looking for lovers through the dating columns of the print media, and she left her ads there as well. But no man did not stay with her for long, because Sheila tended to dominate everything, rigidly suppressing their partners, both in intimate and everyday life. Soon the photo of an attractive girl in the dating section drew the attention of 60-year-old Wilfred Bill LaBar. The man had previously been married twice and had adult children and grandchildren from previous marriages. He was widowed a few years ago and had been living alone on his large country ranch ever since. Bill was a fairly wealthy man. He had a chiropractic office in Epping, New Hampshire, and on the ranch he raised horses. At the same time, he was very lonely and needed a strong, powerful woman. In fact, that's exactly what he found. Sheila was attracted by the wealth of her new acquaintance, and she decided that it would be an ideal union for her. And to make Bill completely lost his head, she began to send him a postal mail frank letters. supplementing them with her nude photos. The trap worked, and soon Labar invited a charming pen pal to visit his ranch. Their romance developed rapidly. An elderly man is not stingy on expensive gifts for a young mistress, and in the summer of 1987, she moved to live with him. This has incredibly flattered the doctor, who now went out in public with a beautiful companion who was half his age and was fit for him as a daughter. Nevertheless, he did not plan to marry Sheila. However, Sheila, not waiting for a marriage proposal, changed her name, calling herself Labar. Bill was surprised by this turn of events, but he did not object. Sheila began to interfere in all the affairs of her elderly lover, starting to control his business, finances, and disposition of his property. In addition, Bill was getting older and could not satisfy the intimate needs of a young woman. Then, according to Sheila herself, he allowed her to meet other men, whom she often brought directly to their home. One of Sheila's regular lovers, closer to the mid-90s, was a Jamaican national named Wayne Ennis. He was much younger than Sheila and was initially hired as an au pair on the ranch, but soon the young man, with Bill's consent, which was probably given under pressure from Sheila, moved to live in the owner's house. In 1995, Sheila and Wayne officially legalized their relationship, and the spouse considered that from now on, he would be her only man. But soon he realized that he was wrong, because his wife continued to meet with different men. Wayne was not satisfied with this, and one day he jumped with fists on Sheila and her next lover, causing them bodily harm. Accustomed to being dominated, Sheila for the first time didn't know how to deal with her third husband, who got into a fight every time a rival appeared on the horizon. Eventually, she filed for divorce and sought a court injunction to stop Wayne from approaching her, accusing him of violence and assault. Another divorce did not affect the turbulent personal life of Sheila, who continued to meet with numerous lovers, changing them like gloves. True, now her relationship increasingly often began to end with lawsuits from men who accused Sheila not just in cruelty, but also in the threat to their lives and health. Thus, one of her boyfriends she deliberately hit by a car and almost ran over. Another almost broke his head, and another scratched his face so that he was forever scarred. Sheila, with age, became more and more dangerous to others. From every man she demanded obedience, and in cases of disobedience, fell into a rage. In 2000, at the age of 74, Bill Labar died of heart failure. Although doctors and police officers did not see a criminal trail in the death of an elderly man, his family members were convinced that Sheila had something to do with it. In their opinion, she had been poisoning Bill little by little for years, and literally drove him into the light. Despite the fact that Bill and Sheila were never officially married, Sheila, according to the will, became the sole heiress of all his property. The relatives tried to challenge this through the courts, but never got anywhere. They are still convinced that the mistress forced Bill to write the will she wanted. House of Temptation. After Bill's death, as I have already mentioned, all his property came under Sheila's complete control. Now she no longer had to consider anyone's opinion. She could do whatever she wanted with the estate she had inherited. She herself called her home a place of seduction and pleasure, where there were no inhibitions. She met men on the streets, in bars, on the internet, lured them to her, and then tried to keep them on the ranch as long as possible. She didn't care about their age, skin color, or any physical appearance. She promised them unearthly pleasure, and then sought to suppress and subjugate them to her will. Sheila regularly tried to seduce couriers by meeting them in the nude and offering an alternative method of payment. But she didn't take into account the fact that she herself was not getting any younger and was nowhere near as attractive as she used to be. They got to the point where couriers simply refused to come to her address. Neighbors noticed that on the ranch Labar constantly come different men, but some hurried to leave the place the same day. Others were delayed, but also for a short time. What was going on in the house itself could only be guessed at. Where had Michael DeLorge disappeared to? Soon, Sheila decided to look for lovers among men who were in dire need of housing, money, or those men who suffered from addiction. This category was the most vulnerable and proved to be an easy prey for the cunning woman, who everywhere posed as a widowed millionaire and talked about her untold wealth, inherited by her. In 2004, Labar met on one of the city streets homeless man named Michael DeLodge. He was in a difficult life situation and lost literally everything because of addiction to illegal drugs. His relatives tried to send him to a rehabilitation clinic, but he ran away from there and has been loitering ever since. Sheila liked Michael, and she invited him to her, promising shelter, food, and the necessary drugs in exchange for intimacy. Moving to the ranch, the guy was completely dependent on his old mistress. He complied with all her demands, afraid to be on the street again. But Sheila quickly got into the taste, and her desires became more and more sophisticated. She bound, beat, and humiliated Michael, taking pleasure in it. He tried to escape several times, walking dozens of miles and hiding in homeless shelters, but he never decided to go to the police for fear they wouldn't believe him. Meanwhile, Sheila found him each time and brought him back to the ranch. In desperation, he tried to contact his family members and let them know he was in trouble. His loved ones immediately responded to this disturbing news, but it was too late. In October 2005, Michael DeLodge disappeared without a trace. When his family contacted Sheila directly, she stated that she and Michael had broken up. He had left her, and his current whereabouts were unknown to her. Michael did not show up at any of the places he had been to before. No one who knew him had seen him, and there was no way to contact him. Contacting the police was fruitless, and Labar remained beyond suspicion, trusting Kenny County. Sheila's tales of her exorbitant wealth were greatly exaggerated, and the house and automobile had to be maintained, so she was forced to get a job. Naturally, Sheila chose an occupation to her liking. She became an operator of intimate phone services. Since she had a truly enchanting voice, men fell for the bait and offered to meet her in person. Among such guys was Kenny County, who at the time of their acquaintance was barely 24 years old. The young man was attractive in appearance, very good-natured and open. However, he had a low IQ level, due to which he was very gullible. This was exactly the kind of guy Labar was looking for. Kenny was very close to his mother, on whom he actually depended, but Sheila, with the help of clever manipulations, managed to break this connection and literally lure Kenny to herself. She made him an unforgettable night of love and promised that they would be like this all the time. The young man decided that he had met the woman of his dreams, about which he informed his relatives, and then moved to live in Sheila's house. But soon Sheila showed the guy her true face, having arranged for him a real torture room in one of the rooms. Each time, intimacy inevitably turned into a brutal beating, or something worse. Kenny's body was covered with bruises, abrasions, scratches, cuts, and burn marks. But he could not leave the house of the mistress who had completely subjugated his will. Sheila did not allow him to see and communicate with his loved ones, and his family could only guess what was happening to Kenny. The first alarm was raised by neighbors who periodically noticed the guy and were horrified by his sickly appearance. A few days before his disappearance, a local store clerk took a picture of the young man on her cell phone camera, and later, this picture was attached to the case file in court. In the photo, Kenny's condition could be described as deplorable. He was very thin, there were huge bruises under his eye and on his cheek, and his nose was probably broken. Judging by the degree of healing, all these injuries had been inflicted at different times, which suggested that the guy had been brutally beaten for a long time. The contents of his cart were also alarming. He rolled 2 large canisters of fuel to the cash register, as it later turned out, for his own cremation. The store employees were so puzzled and even frightened by the guy's appearance that they decided to report him to the police for possible domestic violence. But this time, Sheila managed to get away with it, and they could not charge her with anything. Soon, Kenny stopped contacting his family altogether, and when his worried mother arrived at Labar's house, the owner behaved aggressively and advised to leave Kenny alone. All subsequent attempts ended similarly, at which point Kenny County's family filed a missing persons report with the police, indicating that he may be being held forcibly at the country ranch, a home crematorium, and gruesome findings. When police arrived at Sheila's home, she claimed that the young man no longer lived with her, and claimed that Kenny had run away because his mother, whom he was allegedly terrified of, began visiting them frequently. As evidence, Sheila provided an audio recording in which she asks her lover if his own mother had attacked him, and he quietly gives an affirmative answer. It all seemed more than strange, and the very next day, an officer visiting Sheila secured a search warrant for the estate. Sheila had been on the police's radar many times before, and her name had been linked to another mysterious disappearance of a boyfriend. But over the years, Sheila had never been questioned, and her house and grounds had never been searched. When the police arrived, they did not find Labar at home, but they did see several fires burning near the outbuildings. The fires looked strange and were made of improvised materials, a mattress, fragments of wooden furniture, hay, etc., all doused with a flammable mixture. One of the bonfires had bones in it that clearly looked like human remains. The squad requested reinforcements in the form of forensic experts, reporting all the findings. But that turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg compared to what they discovered next. Almost all over the house were found poorly washed traces of blood. It was so much that it seemed as if there had been a real massacre. It turned out that the blood belonged to at least 3 different people. The bones smoldering in the fire belonged to the missing Kenny, and there were 2 empty fuel cans lying nearby, the same ones the boy had bought at the local store the day before. But that wasn't all. Also found on the property were the remains of Michael Delage, who had disappeared a few years earlier, and some fingers of some third guy who was never identified. Among other things, a large number of items belonging, judging by the size, to various men were fished out of the sump at the ranch, the fates of which have not been learned. The hostess herself was not at home at the time of the police visit. She had figured it out and gone on the run. Sheila hitchhiked to Boston, where she obviously hoped to get lost. Moreover, on the way, she seduced one of the drivers who gave her a ride, and he trustingly invited her to live in his house. However, the next day, having seen on TV news about the search for a dangerous criminal, the new lover himself called the police and reported that Sheila is now in his bed. It was there that she was arrested. During the search of Sheila's home, another frightening find was made, a box of videotapes. On the tapes, Kenny, Michael, and several other men confessed to horrific crimes, but judging by the guy's appearance and condition, they made these confessions under torture. Since Labar's arrest, her mental health has raised a lot of questions, so the court ordered the necessary evaluations. Sheila was found to have a delusional disorder as well as signs of schizophrenia. She called herself an angel sent from heaven to protect children from rapists. It was Sheila's failing mental health that became the basis on which her attorney tried to build a defense. He called his client a profoundly sick person and tried to prove that she was not aware of her actions. The reason for this was the mental and physical trauma she had suffered as a child. The defendant herself claimed that many years ago, when she was in that terrible accident and found herself in a coma on the verge of death, she met with God, and the latter told her to cleanse the world of men who infringe on children. Sheila's ex-husbands and some of Sheila's lovers also spoke in court who, in one voice, called her a crazy, unstable, and extremely violent woman. And Wayne Ennis, the third husband, said that the ex-wife repeatedly persuaded him to kill Mr. Labar in order to seize his property. But despite the defense's attempts to convince the court that Sheila was insane and in need of treatment, it was proven that she was aware of her actions at the time of her crimes. She was found guilty in July 2008 and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of ever being released. All of her appeals were rejected. Sheila is now serving her sentence in Florida at Homestead Correctional Facility. Thanks for watching, guys. That was Jack. Escape to death. In 2003, this high-profile story shook the whole of Brazil and was widely covered by the international media. Hundreds of law enforcers, rescuers, and volunteers from among those who cared about the story were searching for the young couple who disappeared in the forests of Embu Guaçu province. They had hoped to find them alive, but unfortunately those hopes were not realized, and the last days of the young people turned into a real nightmare. But grief-stricken members of the families of the missing ahead awaited another ordeal when the main criminal, rapist, torturer, and brutal killer was not punished, moreover, found himself in better conditions than he lived before. Who are Liana Friedenbach and Felipe Café? Liana Bay Friedenbach was born in São Paulo in May 1987. The girl was the eldest of two children met her parents. She grew up in a fairly well-known and wealthy family. The head of the family, Henry Friedenbach, was a successful lawyer and a very respected man in the city. Felipe Silva Cafe was also a native of Sao Paulo, where he was born in July 1984. But he was brought up in a rather modest, large family. From childhood used to work part-time, tried to provide for himself independently, and help his relatives. Young people met as school children. Between them, there was a friendship, which grew into mutual sympathy and the first youthful love, but they had to hide it in every possible way. It is worth noting that Liana's parents were religious people. They brought up their daughter in strictness. She attended Sunday school from an early age and regularly went to church. Father and mother were categorically against her romantic relationships at such a young age. In addition, social inequality also played a significant role in this matter, because the girl, as I have already said, was from a wealthy family, and her chosen one was poor. But the prohibitions of parents did not force the young people to part. They simply began to hide their affair, secretly arranging dates in different places where no one could see them, in order to spend at least a little time together. One last trip. In the fall of 2003, the lovers decided to get away from everyone for a while, taking a trip to a remote, deserted area to be alone for a while. They carefully prepared for the trip, which was to be an exciting adventure for them. And above all, the boys took care of a plausible alibi that would justify their absence and would not arouse suspicion. Felipe told his parents that he and his friends were going on a camping trip. Liana, on the other hand, could think of nothing better to say than that she was going on a sightseeing trip with the guys from church. She knew for sure that this excuse would work and her parents would let her go, no questions asked. The Friedenbach and Cafe families believed the stories made up by the teenagers and let their children go to their deaths without worrying about anything. Liana and Felipe were unspeakably happy. They could enjoy each other's company for a whole week without fear of inhibitions and censure from their parents. The young people decided to go to a picturesque province called Embu-Guasu. They took with them a tent, sleeping bags, some personal belongings, and a small stock of provisions. But the couple had practically no money, and this caused some difficulties. Being students, they had the right to free public transportation, so the guys thought out and calculated their route in advance to get to their destination by bus. Early in the morning of October 31st, the lovers met at the agreed place, taking care that no one who knew them could see them together. They took the first bus, and after reaching another city in the late evening, they spent the night right in the bus station. Then 2 more transports took them to their desired location. From there, they had to walk a few kilometers to a deserted place hidden in the woods, where they planned to camp and spend a few days alone with each other. The day was warm and sunny, and the young people, in spite of their fatigue after the long journey, were in good spirits, joking, laughing, and making plans for their little vacation. When they reached the place marked on the map, they began to set up their modest but cozy camp. Uninvited guests. When Liana and Felipe traveled to such a remote and secluded place, they did not take into account the fact that in those areas reigns poverty, against which crime thrives. So the appearance of well-dressed young men with large backpacks and bags did not go unnoticed. As the couple walked through the forest to the abandoned farm where they planned to stay, they caught the eye of local bandits fishing near a pond. They were Paulo Cesar de Silva Marques, nicknamed Pernambuco, and Roberto Alves Cardoso, known as Chiampino. The latter was only 16 years old, but he was already the leader of the gang he organized. The criminals were interested in strangers, especially they liked a beautiful young girl. In addition, they decided that in their backpacks there was something to gain, and they could rob them. The bandits stealthily followed the guys and began to watch, lurking in the thickets. The lovers set up a tent, had a snack, and then began to beautify the place of their parking lot. The intruders sat in ambush until they were sure that no one else would join the young men, and they had no weapons on them. Pernambuco and Chiampino then attacked Liana and Felipe, threatening them, and the latter, frightened, did not even try to run away or fight back against the unknown assailants. Having searched all the bags and backpacks, the criminals found nothing that could interest them, Then the bandits decided that they could demand ransom for the boy and the girl from their relatives. Liana, who was scared to death, immediately confirmed that she was from a rich family, and her father would give them as much money as they asked for. The criminals were happy about this turn, but since they had no experience in such cases, they did not know how to organize everything in order to stay with the money and free in the end. Prisoners. While the plan was maturing, and the bandits were trying to figure out who they had in their hands and how much they could ask for their lives, they decided to hide the prisoners so they couldn't escape. Initially, they were taken to a dilapidated structure near the very farm where the boys were staying, but there were no windows or doors. It was soon decided to bring the pair to the home of one of the gang members. There, Felipe was tied up and severely beaten so that he could not make an escape and offer no resistance. That same night, all the gang members took turns taking advantage of the bound and helpless girl, finally breaking her morally. The criminals could not figure out how to demand and collect the ransom, so they simply decided to get rid of the captives and hide their bodies somewhere in the woods so that they would never be found. After torturing the boys, the next day they were taken to a deserted place in the woods. The half-dead Felipe Fernambuco took them deep into the forest, from where a shot was heard, and then the bandit returned alone. Liana realized what had happened and that her beloved was no longer alive, although the kidnappers tried to assure her that they had released the young man. They had other plans for the beautiful young Liana. The scoundrels wanted to keep her as a plaything until they got bored with her, especially since no one had started looking for the missing boys at that time. A couple of days after her daughter's departure, her parents found out that there was no excursion trip with the guys from the church, and Liana's friends don't know where she went. The Friedenbach family guessed that their heiress had run off with her boyfriend and immediately contacted his parents to find out where their children might be. But Cafe's family was sure their son had gone camping with his buddies, so there was nothing they could do to help locate the couple. The situation was complicated by the fact that neither of the young men had been in touch for several days, and their phones were turned off. Thanks to his connections and money, Henri put on their feet literally all the police in the city. Step by step, bit by bit, they managed to reconstruct the route the young people took after they had run away from home by trickery. The police soon reached Embu-Guasu, but the boys got off their last bus, and further their way lay through a deserted wooded area. It was also there that their phones were last online. A large-scale search began, involving police officers, rescuers, and just concerned people who, having learned about the incident, decided to help. A large local businessman also joined the operation, providing his personal helicopter to search from the air and spreading leaflets with photos of the missing young people. Their camp was found quite quickly, and it looked frightening. Despite the lack of signs of blood and fighting, it was clear that something terrible had happened here. The couple's personal belongings had been turned out of their bags and carelessly scattered. The tent had been opened from top to bottom with a knife, and the guys' cell phones were lying around. Scouring every mile, rescuers soon discovered Felipe's breathless body. The tied-up guy had been shot in the back of the head almost at point-blank range, so he had no chance of being rescued. It became clear that the probability of finding Liana alive is minimal, but hope, as they say, dies last. Henri Friedenbach involved the press in the search, making sure that the whole process was widely covered in the media, and as many people as possible learned about it. For any information about Liana's whereabouts, an impressive reward was announced, but it did not help the case: the massacre of Liana. After the criminals got rid of Felipe, they brought Liana back to the house where they had previously held them both. By then, the bandits had been joined by their accomplices, Antonio Gaetano da Silva and Agnaldo Pires. Ciampino proudly announced to them that Liana was his property and could do whatever he wanted with her. He invited everyone to fulfill their dirtiest fantasies with Liana, and his offer was immediately accepted. A day later, after learning about the large-scale search operation, the criminals decided to change their location and moved with the victim to the house of Anthony Matias de Barros, another member of the gang. In the evening of the same day, they went fishing, taking Liana with them. The ringleader threw his jacket over her because it was chilly outside, and he decided to show concern in this way. In the evening, the older brother of Ciampino, whom the juvenile delinquent had not told about his affairs, came to the same place. Ciampino told his brother that Liana was his lover, but he immediately recognized her as the wanted girl. He took his brother aside and said that his captive was being actively sought, so that the police were literally following them. Ciampino took his brother's words as a sign and a call to action. He decided that it was urgent to get rid of Liana and then run away and lay low. He lied to Liana, saying that she was free and he would lead her to the road. In fact, the bandit led his victim into the forest, where he brutally killed her with a knife and then smashed her head with a rock to make sure she was dead. Liana's body was not found until 5 days after the massacre. There was literally no life on her. She was very badly mutilated. Liana was wearing the killer's jacket, which later became one of the key pieces of evidence. The criminals were incredibly cruel, cynical, and ruthless, but at the same time, as stupid and short-sighted. They did not try to run or hide, did not bother to destroy the physical evidence, and at the same time believed that no one would ever find them. This naive self-confidence of the bandits helped the police quickly identify them and apprehend all members of the criminal gang. Ciampino, as I have already said, left his jacket on the victim's body, which had his sweat marks on it. In addition, he brought the murder weapon to his house, washed it, and hid it in the yard, while he tried to wash the clothes with traces of the murdered girl's blood so that he could continue to wear them. According to the results of DNA analysis, it was possible to identify the gang members who had committed violence against Liana. All the gang members were apprehended almost simultaneously. The ringleader not only did not deny it, but immediately began to testify, boasting that it was he who had kidnapped, abused, and then killed the unfortunate victim. He described in detail everything that had happened to Liana in the last days of her life. Following a lengthy trial, almost all of the adult members of the criminal gang received fairly harsh sentences. Hernan Buca was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Felipe. Antonio Gaetano da Silva, as well as Agnaldo Pires, also received life sentences. But Anthony Matias de Barros was sentenced to only 6 years in prison because he himself did not torture the victim, but provided the gang with his house where it all took place. However, with the ringleader and the most brutal member of the gang, everything was not so simple. At the time of his crimes, he himself was barely 16 years old. For this reason, the guy was sent to a specialized prison for minors with a fairly mild regime. Ciampino made several escape attempts, behaved aggressively and inadequately, because of which he was appointed a psychiatric examination. He was found to have several mental abnormalities, which in themselves were not something dangerous, but in the sum gave a monstrous result, turning the young man into a sophisticated sadist and murderer without feelings of pity or remorse. After such a diagnosis, the criminal was transferred to a closed-type medical institution, where he was to undergo compulsory treatment and rehabilitation. No further punishment was ever achieved for him, despite numerous appeals filed by the families of the murdered young men. As a result, Ciampino ended up in better conditions than he had been in before the crime. He now had his own private, cozy room with a large TV, internet access, and a comfortable bed with an orthopedic mattress. He has a balanced 4 meals a day with a customized menu, which is part of the policy of the medical facility where he is being held. His monthly maintenance is estimated at about $12,000. That's about $2,500. In recent years, the perpetrator has regularly petitioned for his release, noting that he has undergone a full course of treatment and no longer poses any threat to others, which means he can return to his normal life. This is a monstrous story,